He is surrounded by 4 identical men, same face, same pale eyes, same massive hands, and every one of them is watching him like he is the only thing in this ocean. His wrists are still raw from the handcuffs. The man who left him to drown is still free. Somewhere north, 12 Omegas are locked in a cargo container running out of time, and the only person alive who holds the coordinates to save them is burning from the inside out. One of the 4 reaches for him. Lior knows it is wrong. He knows it is reckless. He does not pull away. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. The water reached his collarbones, and Lior Vane stopped screaming. Not because he had found calm, because screaming cost oxygen, and oxygen was the only thing keeping him alive inside the flooding hull of the Kestrel, and the waterline was still rising, and the handcuffs connecting him to the anchor chain had long since cut through the skin of both wrists. He had screamed for 40 minutes before he stopped. He had screamed loud enough that his throat had gone raw and the taste of blood was sitting on the back of his tongue. No one was coming. The men who found him in the server room had cuffed him to the chain, flooded the lower decks, and taken their secondary vessel north. He had heard the engines fading. He had heard the hull groaning under incoming water pressure. He had heard all of that, and then he stopped screaming because screaming was not a plan, and he needed a plan, and the water was still rising, and the ceiling of the flooding cabin was 4 feet above him and getting closer at a rate that removed all generous interpretations of his situation. He was 29 years old. He had spent 4 years documenting the trafficking routes the Red Tide network used to move Omegas across international waters. He had spent 4 years in port cities and on fishing vessels and inside cargo operations and behind faces that were not his own face, building a file that would expose the entire command structure of the largest Omega trafficking ring in Southeast Asian waters. 3 weeks ago, he had tracked their flagship vessel to international waters east of the Sulu Sea. 3 weeks of cover work aboard the Kestrel, acting as a contracted data analyst while copying files and memorizing coordinates and documenting the names of every person who moved through that vessel's operation. He had been this close. 3 weeks of work, 4 years of leads, and the sum total outcome was Renard Vitch's 2 largest security personnel finding him in the server room at 2 in the morning with a portable drive in his hand. Renard Vitch did not leave loose ends. Lior had known this before he ever boarded the Kestrel. He had calculated the risk and decided the documentation was worth it. Standing in the flooding hull of the Kestrel with the cold water rising past his chin and the handcuff chain holding him to the anchor bracket, he was revising that calculation. He tilted his head back and pressed his face to the 4 inches of airspace remaining between the water surface and the cabin ceiling. He breathed. Just breathed. Cold air that tasted like diesel and rust. He breathed it because it was there, and because breathing was still possible, and as long as it was possible, he had not run out of options entirely. The hull exploded. A section of port side below the waterline blew inward, and the shockwave hit him underwater before he fully processed that the sound was not the hull failing on its own. The force slammed his head into the anchor chain bracket and he went blank. He came back conscious, already fully submerged, lungs burning, arms still cuffed to the chain. The cabin was completely flooded. He pulled at the chain with every bit of strength his body had, and the chain bracket held. He pulled again. His vision was going gray at the edges. There was no air anywhere in reach, and the cold was in his core, and his body was running out of time, and he understood with complete clarity that this was it. Something caught his wrist. Not the chain. A hand. A grip so solid and certain that it registered to his oxygen-deprived brain as something structural, as something that was not moving, as something he could pull against. He pulled against it, and the hand did not release. A second hand came to the handcuff itself. He felt metal cutting, felt the cuff open, felt both his arms come free from the chain. The hand on his wrist held on. It pulled. He broke the surface, gasping so hard his body did not produce sound. Just the physical mechanics of air entering where there was no air before. He was in open ocean. The Kestrel was 60 feet to his left, sinking bow first, the stern lifting out of the water in its last 10 seconds above the surface. The sun was late afternoon and brutal. He was alive. He was breathing. He was being held above the water by one hand belonging to one arm belonging to a man who was treading water beside him with what appeared to be total effortlessness, despite being large enough that his shoulders alone were displacing a significant volume of the Sulu Sea. The alpha scent hit Lior before he fully registered the man. Rich and dark and heavy, layered under salt water and the sharp, specific smell of ocean-soaked skin. It was the strongest alpha scent Lior had encountered in his adult life, and it came from the man who was holding him, and Lior's Omega biology responded to it without asking his brain's permission. His Omega gland, at the back of his neck, lit up. The biological signal was immediate and unmistakable and absolutely unwelcome given current circumstances. He looked at the man's face. Severe angles, a jaw that looked like it had been made from something dense, eyes that sat between gray and green with nothing that simple about the color, pale and focused and currently doing a rapid assessment of Lior's condition with complete professional attention. Dark hair flattened against his skull from the dive. He was enormous, not just tall, built wide and deep with the kind of muscle that belonged to sustained physical work, not ornamental. 3 more men surfaced around them. The same face, the exact same face, the same jaw, the same pale gray-green eyes, replicated 3 times, with minor differences that took Lior's dazed brain a moment to sort. One was broader across the shoulders than the others. One had a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. One was already scanning the surrounding water with a device he had apparently kept waterproof inside his dive suit. Quadruplets. 4 identical alphas in the water around him, and the combined weight of their scent was making Lior's gland burn. "My name is Zoran Drevin," said the one holding him. He said it the way someone stated a fact at a briefing, flat and direct and containing exactly the necessary information. "We are IMOPA. We have been tracking the Kestrel for 11 days. I need you to stay conscious. Can you do that?" It was not a question. Lior tried to say yes, and produce something in that direction. Zoran Drevin pulled him toward a deployed life raft 30 feet out, and Lior let himself be moved because his legs were producing more intent than result, and he had no better plan. The other 3 reached the raft first and hauled him over the rubber side with coordinated efficiency. He hit the raft floor and shook. The shaking was deep and involuntary, cold working through his core from 2 hours of cold water exposure. He registered hands on him immediately. Large hands pressing an emergency foil blanket around his body. Large hands at his wrist, checking his pulse. Large hands examining the cuts the handcuffs had left on both wrists. "I am Everin," said the one with the foil blanket. His hands were careful despite their size. "Tell me if you have injuries beyond your wrists." Lior did an assessment. His head was ringing from the hull impact. His ribs had been hurting since the 2 security personnel introduced him to the corridor floor with their boots. His Omega gland was burning, and that was not an injury, but it was a problem. "Ribs," he said. "Head. That is everything." Everin pressed 2 fingers carefully through the foil blanket against the bruised area, and Lior's breath went short. "Not fractured," Everin said to the others. "Bruised. Possibly one cracked." He would not have held his breath long enough for us to reach him if anything punctured. "I am Caius," said the one who had been checking his pulse. He had released Lior's wrist, but his eyes had not moved from Lior's face. They were the same pale gray-green as Zoran's, and had the same focused quality applied differently, more personal, more direct. A secondary vessel departed this location 90 minutes ago, heading north-northwest. We need to know who was aboard it and where it was going. "Reinhard Vitch," Lior said. He was surprised that his voice came out level. His journalist's processing was running, and when that part of his brain engaged, everything else went orderly. He had 3 lieutenants with him, Marek, Solano, and a woman the crew called Duchess. They were heading to a handoff point. I have the coordinates. I memorized them from their navigation system. He looked at all 4 of them, and then specifically at Zoran, who had hauled himself over the raft side and was now kneeling with his forearms on his thighs, looking at Lior with those pale eyes. "They are moving 12 Omegas currently in cargo containers aboard a vessel called the Dawnbreak. The handoff is 48 hours from now. If your intercept team can reach position in the next 24 hours, they can take both vessels." Zoran did not move for 2 full seconds. Then he looked at the 4th brother, the one with the scanning device, and said one word, "Taveth." "Already transmitting," said Taveth. He had the same face as the others and a sharpness to his eyes that sat differently from Caius, more like a man who was already calculating 3 moves forward from whatever he was looking at. He did not glance up from his device. "I have position. Intercept team will be on station before the Dawnbreak arrives at target coordinates." 12 Omegas, Zoran said. His eyes had come back to Lior's face. "You got yourself handcuffed to a sinking hull for 12 Omegas. Lior pulled the foil blanket tighter around his shoulders and held Zoran's gaze without looking away. 347, he said. "That is how many Omegas the Red Tide Network has moved in the past 4 years. 12 is what is on the water right now." None of the 4 said anything for a moment. The raft moved. The Kestrel finished its departure from the surface of the Sulu Sea with a sound like a long, slow release of pressure, and then there was just open water where it had been. Lior felt the moment his body decided his rational mind was losing the argument. He had been without scent suppressants for 4 days. He had run out on the Kestrel 5 days into his 3-week cover assignment and had been unable to get more without breaking his cover. 4 days of no suppressants, followed by 2 hours of hypothermic cold water, followed by physical trauma, followed by being hauled into an enclosed raft space with 4 compatible alphas whose combined scent was filling every breath he took. His omega gland had been burning since the moment Zoran's hand closed on his wrist. The burning was getting worse. His skin, which should have been cold, was starting to produce heat from the inside. His body was producing slick and he could feel it, and the feeling made him press his knees together and work through 3 separate obscene words in his head without producing any of them out loud. He was going into heat. Not might be going into heat. Was going. His biology had received sufficient inputs, calculated its conclusion, and had begun executing without consulting him. Unsuppressed, trauma-triggered, alpha proximity accelerated, full onset in 30 minutes at the outside. He had maybe 20 minutes of functional, rational thought left before his brain stopped being the decision-maker. He breathed through his mouth instead of his nose. It did not meaningfully help. The alpha scent was already in his system. Caius went still first. That specific stillness that alphas went to when their instincts registered something their cognition had not caught up with yet. He said, quietly, Zoran. Zoran looked at Lior, then at Evren. He is not on suppressants, Evren said. Several days without. The cold water masked his base scent initially. It is coming through now as his core temperature rises. His jaw was tight. His hands had stopped moving over the first aid kit. Lior looked at all 4 of them. He kept his voice, even by putting his journalist's delivery on top of his biology's current noise. I am aware of what is happening. I need suppressants. Do you have any? Evren checked the kit twice. Then he looked at Lior and his expression answered before his words did. Standard field issue. No pharmaceuticals beyond wound care. Lior closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Opened them. The heat was progressing fast, faster than it might have without the trauma and the cold shock. His skin was prickling. The slick was soaking through the inside of his clothing, and he was acutely aware of it and aware that 4 alphas at this range could smell exactly what was happening to him. His hole was clenching on nothing, and the emptiness was starting to register as a persistent, aching demand his body intended to escalate until something was done about it. How far to the nearest landmass? He said. Tavith did not look up. 58 kilometers. Motor and current. 4 hours minimum. Lior processed this. An omega in unsuppressed heat, accelerated by physical trauma and direct alpha proximity, did not have 4 hours before rational thought became unavailable. He had 20 minutes of clear thinking, and then the heat would be running the conversation. He used those 20 minutes to do what he always did when a situation had limited viable options. He laid them out. Give me the options, he said. He said it to all 4 of them because they were IMOPA professionals and because he was going to treat this the way he treated everything, as a problem with a soluble structure if you looked at it without flinching. Zoran answered. He answered with the same flat directness he had for everything else, and Lior registered that he was grateful for it because he did not have patience for anything dressed up right now. 2 options. We run the motor at full and attempt land before full heat onset. Probability of reaching medical facilities in time is under 15% given fuel and current. The second option is that we provide manual assistance through the heat. Manual means exactly what you understand it to mean. We are a bonded pack. We are IMOPA certified for Omega Crisis Response. Nothing happens without your consent, and we stop at any point you ask. He paused. Those are the options. Lior looked at him. Then at Evren, who was watching him with something in his expression that had moved past clinical. At Caius, who had not blinked. At Tavith, who was looking at his device with the particular focused attention of a man who was letting someone else handle the front of the conversation while he processed everything from the side. His heat was in his chest now, pressing outward. His breathing was audible. He was producing slick at a rate that was beyond his ability to ignore. His omega gland was so sensitized that the air moving across the back of his neck felt like direct pressure. He thought about what 15% meant. He thought about full, unsupported heat onset in open water in an inflatable life raft with 4 alphas and no pharmaceutical options and no way to get distance from the scent. He thought about what IMOPA crisis response certification meant in practical terms. He thought about Renard Vitch handcuffing him to an anchor bracket and walking away. He had survived that. He was going to survive this too, and he was going to do it the same way he survived everything else. Clear assessment, direct action. No wasted time on things that were not the next step. I consent, he said. He said it looking at Zoran because Zoran was clearly the one the pack deferred to in operational terms, to all four of you. But you understand what this is. This is a biological emergency. When we reach land, whatever happens in this raft is finished. Is that clear? Zoran held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, clear. What happened next moved faster than Lior expected, and also not fast enough for what his body was demanding. Evren shifted close, and the warmth radiating off his body reached Lior's skin immediately. He was the broadest of the four, the one whose physical presence was the most overwhelming in terms of sheer size, and his heat was considerable. He did not touch Lior yet. He just put his body close enough that Lior could feel the warmth and the weight of his scent at short range, and Lior's omega gland responded to that proximity with a spike of heat that went through his core and made his head drop back against the raft's rubber wall. You are shaking, Evren said, low and even. That is the heat, Lior said. Cold shock is still part of it too. Evren's hand moved to the back of Lior's neck, not on the gland, just above it, fingers pressing firmly into the muscle that had been at maximum tension since the moment the hull started flooding. The pressure of it released something that traveled the length of Lior's spine, and his breath went out long and uncontrolled, and he made a sound he had not planned to make. Evren's thumb moved in a slow, firm circle, and the sound repeated, and Lior stopped trying to prevent it. Caius had moved to kneel in front of him, close. His eyes on Lior's face had the quality of a man who had decided to look at something without reservation. Your color is coming back, he said. His voice was rougher than Zoran's, lower in register. Are you in pain? Not the kind you mean, Lior said. Something moved through Caius's expression. He reached out and took Lior's jaw in his fingers. Not rough, just present, and tipped his head forward slightly to look at the omega gland at the back of Lior's neck. It was flushed, visibly. The gland was swollen with heat response and reactive to air movement, and the proximity of Caius's face near it made Lior's body clench and flood. He could feel the slick soaking through his clothing now. He was wet and hot, and his hole was aching with a demand that his nervous system was prioritizing above everything else. Caius's thumb traced the edge of the gland without touching the center of it, and the proximity sent a jolt through Lior's nervous system that made his hips jerk forward. Zoran had moved in on his other side. Tavith was close behind him. Lior was surrounded on all sides by alpha, warmth, and scent, and the combined weight of 4 powerful biology signals, all pointing at him, and his body was responding to every one of them at once. His arousal was pressing hard against his wet clothes. His hole was producing slick steadily. The aching emptiness was getting louder and more specific by the second. Tell me what you need, Zoran said. His mouth was at Lior's ear, and Lior felt the words as much as heard them. His voice was low and deliberate, and it resonated through Lior's chest in a way that went straight to the heat. Anything you can take. We give you what you ask for. The heat was at the point where Lior could still form specific requests. Another 10 minutes and that window was going to close. He did not waste the window. Touch me, he said. All of you. Start with my back and work forward. Zoran's hand went to his lower back, large and warm and firm through his wet clothing, and Lior felt the weight of it travel through his spine and settle in his gut. Tavith's hands came to his shoulders from behind, working down from the base of his neck in long, deliberate strokes. Evren's hand at the back of his neck maintained its position, thumb still moving. Caius's fingers left his jaw and moved to his throat, pressing against his pulse point with 2 fingers while his thumb pressed the underside of his jaw. Lior breathed. He let the 4 separate sources of warmth and pressure work through the cold that was still sitting in his core from 2 hours in the water. He breathed and felt his body respond to being touched by 4 hands at once in 4 distinct places. He breathed and let his omega biology stop fighting the input and start using it. The slick was worse now, soaking through his clothing and dripping against the rubber floor of the raft, and the smell of it joined the 4 alpha scents in the enclosed space and created a specific feedback cycle that pushed every biological signal in all 5 of them higher simultaneously. He felt the exact moment Caius located the secondary response point on his throat. It was at the base, just above the collarbone, where the vagal nerve ran close to the surface. An omega's secondary trigger. Most alphas did not know it existed or went for the gland directly out of instinct. Caius found it with 2 fingers and pressed, and the shock of sensation that went through Lior was enough to blank his vision for a full second. His hips drove forward. His hands grabbed the nearest solid thing, which was Caius's wrists, and he grabbed them and held on while Caius pressed again harder, and Lior made a sound that came from below his conscious management. "There it is," Caius said. He was not talking to the others. He was talking to Lior, his voice rough and low, and he pressed the spot again and held the pressure this time, and Lior pulled at his wrists, and Caius came with the pull, moving closer, close enough that his breath was on Lior's face, and the scent of him at this range was making the space between Lior's temples pound. "I need," Lior started. "Say it," Caius said. "My clothes off. All of them. Right now." It happened fast and without confusion because the 4 of them operated as a pack and had apparently decided that efficiency was the correct approach. Zoran's hands went to Lior's shirt from behind and pulled it up and off. Evren had his hands on Lior's bare back before the shirt had fully cleared. Tavith was on his right, and his hands moved to Lior's sides, warming skin that was still cool from the water. Caius worked Lior's pants down and off him with the directness of someone solving a logistical problem and leaving no element unaddressed. The wet underwear followed. Lior was bare in the center of the life raft, surrounded by 4 fully clothed alphas, and the air temperature hit his skin and then was replaced by the warmth of 4 bodies close to him, and the contrast of being the only one exposed while they were all covered sent a pulse of heat through him so sharp that he reached out and grabbed the front of Caius's shirt. "You too," he said, looking at Caius and then sweeping his eyes to include all of them. "All of you. Now." The 4 Dreven brothers stripped without ceremony and without looking at each other, which told Lior they had sufficient shared history that coordinating on something this basic required no communication. He was aware that he was watching them undress and making no attempt to look elsewhere, and he did not try to correct this. His heat had his body's priorities sorted, and looking elsewhere was not on the list. They were the same, and not the same genetic structure, differentiated by 31 years of different work and different injuries and different lives. Zoran had 2 old knife scars low on his left side, and his face in this context had lost the briefing room flatness and was showing something underneath it that was not professional. Evren was the broadest by a clear measure, the kind of muscular development that came from sustained heavy physical work over years, and he was watching Lior with his jaw tight and his breathing already changed. Caius had a dark tattooed band across his right forearm, and his eyes on Lior had the focused intensity of a man who had stopped calculating anything and was just present in the specific. Tavith was leaner than his brothers, sharper in the way his proportions read, and he was looking at Lior with the same perceptive attention he gave everything, but it was warmer now, more specific. All 4 of them were hard. Lior looked at that directly because his heat had removed the mechanism that would have made him look away. All 4 of them, hard and close and producing a combined alpha scent that had Lior so wet with slick that his thighs slid against each other when he shifted his weight. His own arousal was aching and untouched. His hole was clenching and leaking, and the emptiness of it was the loudest sensation in his body. "Get your mouth on me," he said. He looked at Caius and said, "Now." Caius put his hands on Lior's hips and pressed him flat against the raft floor and settled between his legs with the directness of a man who had been given permission and intended to use it completely. His mouth went to Lior's inner thigh first, hot and open, teeth scraping against the skin there, and Lior's hips came up before the contact fully processed. Then Caius moved to his hole and pressed his tongue flat against the slick-soaked entrance and licked. The sound Lior made was not something he attempted to manage. He was in a life raft in the Sulu Sea, 60 kilometers from any inhabited land, and the only people in range were the 4 alphas surrounding him, and none of them needed him to be quiet. He gripped the rubber sides of the raft and pressed into Caius's mouth and made the sounds his body needed to make while Caius ate his hole open with focused, relentless attention. Caius's tongue worked into him, pushing through the slick, tasting him, pressing inside him, and Lior's legs fell open wider and his back arched up off the rubber floor. "Evren," he said. His voice was wrecked, deeper than his usual register, rougher, stripped of every layer that was not immediate need. "Come down here. I need more than one." Evren moved, and Lior felt the coordination between them without looking, felt Caius's tongue withdraw and Evren's replace it, broader and applying more pressure, Evren's large hands spreading his thighs wider and holding him open. The slick was pouring out of him, He was dripping onto the raft floor and he could hear it and feel it and smell it, and the smell of his own heat mixing with 4 alpha scents made his vision blur at the edges. Then Caius's mouth closed around him and his brain made one abortive attempt to process 2 mouths working him simultaneously before abandoning the attempt because there was not enough blood in his head to run that calculation. Caius worked his mouth down his shaft while Evren worked his tongue deeper into his hole. Lior had both hands fisted in the rubber grip of the raft sides. He was making continuous, unstructured sounds. His hips were moving, rocking between the two, and Evren's hands on his thighs were the only thing holding him to a stable position because his own muscles had stopped prioritizing that. Zoran's hand moved into his hair, not pulling, just there, grounding. Lior turned his head, and Zoran was right there, kneeling close, his pale, gray-green eyes level with Lior's, watching his face with complete attention and something in that attention that had moved well past operational. Lior looked at him and Zoran looked back and the eye contact held while Evren's tongue pressed deeper and Caius's throat worked around him and Lior kept making sounds that had no structure left in them. "I want you," Lior said. He said it directly at Zoran. He said it with what rational processing he still had available, and it was enough to make the want feel chosen and not just biological. "I want you inside me." Zoran's hand tightened in his hair, a short tightening, controlled, and then releasing. "You will have me," he said. His voice had dropped in register from the briefing tone. "Evren and Caius are going to make you come first. Both of them. When you have come, I am going to claim you." The promise traveled through Lior from his skull to his toes. He pulled Zoran's wrist toward him and Zoran let him, leaning close enough that Lior could feel his breath. His free hand pressed flat against Lior's bare chest, feeling his heartbeat, and Lior felt that pressure through everything else and held Zoran's eyes and stopped holding anything back at all. Evren worked his tongue in deeper and his thumb pressed against the stretched rim of Lior's hole, while his tongue moved and the stimulation stacked on top of Caius's mouth, working him, and on top of Zoran's hand against his chest, and on top of Tavith's hand that had settled on the inside of his left thigh, warming the skin there, thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles that covered territory no one else was touching. Lior registered all 4 points of contact simultaneously. He registered that the heat had his whole nervous system open in a way that made each touch land harder than it would have without the heat running. He registered that he was going to come, and that when he came it was going to be the kind of release his body had been building toward for 40 minutes of terror and cold water and rising heat and nowhere to put any of it. He came with Evren's tongue inside him, and Caius's mouth on him, and Zoran's hand pressed to his chest. He felt it start deep in his core and expand outward in a wave that hit every nerve at once. He heard himself, sharp and high and without any of his usual self-management in it. He felt his whole clamp and flutter around Evren's tongue and felt the wet heat of his release pulse against Caius's lips. Caius made a low, satisfied sound against him that traveled through the contact and Lior felt it through his entire body. Evren did not withdraw his tongue. He kept working through the release and into the oversensitivity that came after it. Slow, deliberate presses into the clenching wet heat of Lior's hole, drawing the release out past the point where Lior thought it was finished. Lior said something that may have been a word. His thighs were shaking in Evren's grip. His hand had found Zoran's wrist and was holding it against his own chest. When Evren finally sat back, Lior could see the slick glistening on his lower face. Caius was wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and watching Lior with an expression that Lior's heat-saturated brain catalogued and set aside to examine later. It was not the expression of a man completing a crisis response task. It was the expression of someone who had encountered something they were not prepared to let go of. Lior lay flat and breathed. The heat had not reduced. The first release had cut through the worst of the acute pressure, but the heat was still running, still demanding, still filling his body with slick and aching need. His hole was clenching on nothing, and the emptiness of it was going to become the loudest problem in the room again in approximately 90 seconds. He looked at Zoran. "Come here," Lior said. Zoran moved over him without hurrying. That was the first thing Lior registered. Not the size of him, not the scent at this range, not the warmth coming off his chest, the absence of urgency. Every other alpha Lior had encountered in a heat situation moved with the specific momentum of someone answering a biological demand. Zoran settled his weight above him with the deliberate attention of a man who had decided to do something and intended to do it completely, and the difference between those two things landed in Lior's sternum before anything physical had happened. He braced his forearms on either side of Lior's head and looked at him, not scanning, looking. Lior looked back because looking away would have been wrong, and also because his heat had stripped out his capacity for the kind of managed eye contact he typically maintained to keep interactions from getting specific. He was looking at Zoran Dreven in the dark of a life raft in the Sulu Sea, with his hole dripping slick onto the rubber floor and his whole body still shaking from his body's first release. And there was nothing managed in any of it. Zoran lowered his mouth to Lior's and kissed him. Nothing about it was clinical. It was the way a man kissed someone he had been deciding to kiss and had stopped pretending otherwise. Lior kissed him back with everything that had been sealed and compressed and operational for 4 years, and what came through the seal was not the journalist and not the investigator. Zoran made a sound against him when he felt it and pressed harder, and Lior pulled at his shoulders and gave it back harder. Then Zoran shifted his hips, and Lior felt the broad head of his length pressing against his soaked entrance, and his thinking went below the neck entirely. He pushed in, slow and deliberate, measuring Lior's body on each inch and applying exactly enough force to keep moving through it. The stretch was significant. Lior was soaked with slick and heat open, but Zoran was large, and the press of him working deeper required all of Lior's breath directed specifically at staying open. Each increment of depth made the previous level feel like preparation. Lior's nails went into Zoran's shoulders and his head went back, and he made a sound that had nothing managed in it. Zoran stopped when fully seated and held completely still. He let Lior feel all of him, let his body work through the adjustment of being this filled and this stretched. Lior felt the adjustment happening, his hole clenching and releasing around Zoran's shaft, the deep ache of it spreading through his lower body. He pressed his hips up slightly, testing, and felt how completely Zoran's weight had him pinned. "All right," Zoran said, low and direct. "Better than," Lior said. "Move." Zoran moved. The rhythm built from deliberate to forceful without losing the deliberateness, each thrust pulling back far enough that Lior felt every inch of the withdrawal and driving forward fully, hips pressing fully against him each time. The sounds filling the raft were obscene, skin and slick and the creak of the rubber, and Lior's continuous noise underneath all of it. He pushed up to meet each thrust and pulled at Zoran's shoulders and stopped tracking the sounds because tracking them would have required attention he did not have. Evren's hands moved under his hips and lifted, changing the angle. Tavith had his mouth against Lior's throat, teeth pressing into the skin above his pulse point in a bite that walked the line between pressure and pain, and Lior's head turned into it. Caius had both hands on his chest, working the sensitive points of his chest in firm, slow circles, and the stimulation hit him everywhere at once. Zoran's knot was forming. Lior felt it on each withdrawal, the swell at the base beginning, pressing and releasing at his entrance. His body answered it with a flood of slick so intense it ran down his thighs, his whole stretching and softening toward what was building. The knot pressed and caught on each pullback, held for one beat, released, returned with more force. His grip on Zoran's forearms went tight, and he stopped trying to stay still. "You're not," Lior said. His voice had gone to something below his usual register. "Give me your knot right now." Zoran's hands on his hips tightened past comfort into something that would leave marks, and Lior did not mind. The rhythm went harder, and the knot pressed in and caught, and his body stretched around it and fought it, and then on one deep driving thrust it seated fully inside him and locked. The stretch of the knot filling him completely hit every nerve simultaneously. He came screaming into the open air above the Sulu Sea, not muffled, not managed, no one within range to care. His whole clenched and pulsed, and he felt Zoran come inside him, heat flooding in long, thick pulses while the knot kept everything locked in place. Caius's hands were on his chest. Evren had his lower back. Tavith's mouth was against his temple. He felt all four of them, and the knot, and Zoran's weight over him and the release of all of it at once, and he kept coming past the point where he had anything left to give. The knot held them for 12 minutes. Lior lay under Zoran and breathed and shook and felt every pulse still moving inside him and made no attempt to speak because speech was not available. When the knot finally released, Zoran pulled back slowly, and Lior felt the warm flood of release run out of him, and felt the empty ache, the knot left behind, and felt the second wave of heat beginning to gather before he had finished. Processing the first. His body was not finished. His biology had more to say. "Caius," Lior said. Caius moved with the focused efficiency of a man who had been watching and waiting and had already decided exactly what he intended to do. He positioned Lior face down on the raft floor, hands gripping his hips and pulling them up, and Lior went with it because his heat knew what was coming and was already flooding with anticipation. Caius put his mouth on Lior's hole from behind without preamble. His tongue pressed flat against the stretched wet entrance and worked in wide strokes, tasting the slick and Zoran's release still leaking from him, making a low, satisfied sound against him that Lior felt vibrate through his whole lower body. He ate Lior's whole with total focus, no hesitation, licking into him deep and working the stretched rim with his lips and pushing his tongue in and moving it in slow circles until Lior's arms were shaking under him and his face was pressed to the rubber and he was saying please in a continuous low voice. 3 of Caius's fingers joined his tongue and the stretch of them alongside the tongue was its own specific undoing. Lior's arms gave out. He dropped to his elbows with his hips still in Caius's grip and let the sounds he was making get as loud as they needed to be. Caius worked 4 fingers into him while his mouth worked the outer rim, and the stretch burned in the way that his heat-sensitized body converted directly to pleasure. You taste like both of you already, Caius said against him. His voice was rough, rougher than it had been at the start of the afternoon. Before tonight is over, you are going to taste like all 4 of us. The words and the sensation hit together and Lior pushed back into it and said harder. Said please, said Caius. Caius pulled his fingers and his mouth back simultaneously and then drove in hard and the full penetration hit Lior so suddenly his vision widened. The angle, face down with his hips pulled back, put the depth at its immediate maximum, and Lior felt every bit of it and said something loud and not quite a word into the rubber floor. Caius started at the pace he intended to maintain. The force of each thrust rocked Lior forward, and the sounds of it filled every inch of the raft. One hand released his hip and reached around to grip him firmly, squeezing in a pulsing rhythm that matched the thrusts, and Lior's arms went out from under him again. He dropped flat, and Caius came with him, covering him, fucking him into the floor with controlled force that was not rough for its own sake but was rough because Caius had calculated exactly what Lior's body wanted and was delivering it. Come for me right now, Caius said against the back of his neck. The command landed in Lior's heat brain and hit every switch it had. He came hard with Caius's hand gripping him and Caius's shaft buried inside him and his face pressed to the rubber. His hole clamped and fluttered and he felt Caius curse against his neck and drive deeper and the overstimulation pushed another wave through him before the first finished. He was leaking slick and his own release against the floor and still shaking when Caius's knot formed and pressed in and locked. Caius came inside him with his teeth at the back of Lior's shoulder, not biting down, just pressing, and the restraint of it was more intense than a bite. The knot held. Caius kept his full weight over him through the tie, not moving, just present and heavy and thoroughly there, and Lior lay under him and shook and let the knot keep everything locked in place and thought nothing coherent for its duration. When the knot released, Caius withdrew and then moved to Lior's side and pressed his mouth to Lior's throat at the pulse point, not the gland, the pulse. He held his lips there and felt Lior's heartbeat come down and said nothing because nothing needed saying. Tavith, Lior said. He turned his head and found Tavith watching from 3 feet away with that sharp, perceptive expression. Come here. Tavith moved in with the efficiency he applied to everything. He did not cover Lior's body. He sat beside him and ran one hand down the full length of his spine, slow and deliberate, and Lior felt each centimeter with the hypersensitized nerve endings of someone in the 3rd hour of a heat. You have been responding most intensely at specific pressure points, Tavith said. His voice was in its neutral reporting register. I have been noting which ones. He pressed 2 fingers into the dimples at the base of Lior's spine, and Lior's hips drove off the floor immediately. Tavith's not quite smile was audible. That one. He worked those points in sequence, his fingers and his mouth targeting each one in order, building the stimulation layer by layer. He said things in a low, precise voice about what he was observing and what he intended to do next, and the clinical quality of the words combined with the entirely non-clinical reality of the actions took Lior apart differently than the previous 2 rounds. When Tavith finally positioned himself and pushed in, Lior was so thoroughly worked up that the first thrust sent him over immediately. He came before Tavith found his rhythm, his hole clenching hard around the shaft entering him, and Tavith pressed in fully through it and made a sound that was the least controlled thing Lior had heard from him. Tavith moved with precision that was not coldness. Each movement was calculated for effect, and the effect was Lior losing language by the 3rd minute. When Tavith's knot swelled and pressed in, Lior was already shaking so hard his teeth were tight together, and the knot locking fully inside him hit the specific internal point Tavith had spent 20 minutes identifying, pressing it from the inside. Lior went somewhere else for a while and came back to Tavith's hand, rubbing slow circles on his lower back. The 3rd wave of heat began to gather as the 2nd receded. lower and slower than the previous two, the final surge before the heat broke completely. Lior recognized it. Without suppressants, and with this much already worked through, the third wave would be shorter, more of a long, sustained burn than an explosion. Evren, Lior said. Evren was already there. He had been the closest since the second wave broke, and when Lior said his name, he gathered Lior into his lap rather than pushing him down. Lior's back against Evren's chest, Lior's legs over his thighs, both arms wrapped around him. The contact hit him through every surface they shared. Third wave, Evren said against his hair. I have you, all the way through. Lior let his head drop against Evren's shoulder and closed his eyes, and let Evren take the weight. He had been braced since the moment the Kestrel's hull started flooding. He had been braced for longer than that. Having someone take the weight was the most complete thing that had happened to him in 3 hours of very complete things. Evren worked him through the third wave with hands that were careful and thorough, fingers finding him slick-soaked and clenching and working him open while Lior sat in his lap and let the heat run its final distance. When Evren finally lifted him and brought him down slowly onto his shaft, Lior felt every inch of the descent with the hypersensitivity of a body in its last heat stage. The fullness was different from the previous rounds. Like his body had been waiting for this specific fit. Evren took him slow, long rolling strokes that held at depth before withdrawing. His arms stayed wrapped around Lior's chest through each motion. His mouth stayed against the back of Lior's neck, lips pressed to the skin there without moving. Lior said Evren's name twice, just his name, and Evren made a sound against his neck that was answer enough. When Lior came, it was quiet compared to the previous rounds, long and thorough and traveling through his whole body at an even depth rather than spiking and crashing. He felt Evren come inside him with the same quality, deep and sustained, the knot forming and locking while both of them were still moving through their release. Evren held him through the tie with both arms and did not let go. The heat broke while they were still tied. Lior felt it go. The specific biological urgency that had been running his body's priorities for 4 hours went out like a pressure valve releasing. What replaced it was the total exhaustion of a body that had been in extreme distress for the better part of a day, and the bone-deep satisfaction that heat resolution produced, and something else underneath both of those things that had been building since before the heat started, and that was not biological and was not going away. He lay in Evren's lap and breathed and let himself be held and noted, with the returning clarity of a mind coming back online after extended heat, that being held was something he had not permitted in longer than he could accurately calculate. Motor, he said. 30 minutes to dock, Evren said. Zoran called it while you were still in the third wave. He paused. You slept briefly. Lior processed this. He had slept during a heat, on a life raft, in Evren Draven's lap. He accepted this information and moved forward from it. He found his clothes and put them on. He wrapped the foil blanket around his shoulders and watched the lights of the coastal city resolve on the horizon and let his journalist's processing reassemble itself around the situation. He had coordinates to deliver, an intercept to support, 4 years of documentation to hand over to the people who could act on it. He had work, and the work was the next step. He looked at Zoran at the prow. Zoran was already looking at him. The support vessel took them at a private berth on the South Harbor. 2 IMOPA support staff handled the lines and did not ask questions because IMOPA support staff did not ask questions about Omegas and Alphas and life rafts and the particular atmospheric conditions of a space that had clearly been through something significant, clean clothing, a medical kit, a thermos of strong black coffee that Lior held in both hands and inhaled before drinking. The debrief happened at the cabin table. All 4 Drevens present, plus a support analyst named Wreckage who processed operational intelligence with flat professional competence. Lior gave them everything his memory had stored from the Kestrel's navigation systems. The Dawnbreak's registration number, the handoff coordinates, the timing window, the secondary contact vessel, the names of all 12 Omegas in Cargo Container 7, transcribed from Vitch's manifest 3 days before his cover was blown. The full command structure he had built across 4 years, financial routing, the 3 border officials on Vitch's payroll, the lawyer in Singapore who handled the false employment documentation. He delivered it in sequence for 45 minutes while Brackett's keyboard worked and the intercept team coordinates updated on the screen above the table. Tavith had confirmed intercept team positioning before the debrief concluded. The Dawnbreak had reduced speed at the handoff coordinates. Zoran authorized the boarding action at 0100 local time. Lior sat with his coffee and waited. He was not good at waiting. He had spent 4 years being good at it by necessity, and had not gotten better, just more practiced at the specific controlled stillness that looked like patience from the outside while running full operational assessment inside. He waited for 6 hours. Caius kept a screen open with intercept status and reported in brief sentences at regular intervals. Everin appeared with food twice and with fresh dressing for Lior's wrists once, and checked his ribs with hands that were careful and did not require thanks. At 0300 the boarding team hit the dawnbreak from 3 points. Caius's updates arrived in fast sequence. Dawnbreak crew, in custody, all 8. Secondary contact vessel taken 2 miles out. Cargo containers being accessed. Then, 12 Omegas confirmed safe. All 12. Lior put his coffee down and put both hands flat on the table and held them there. 347 was the number he had carried for 4 years. 12 was what was on the water tonight. 12 were safe. 12 who were not going to end up at whatever destination Vitch's distribution chain had assigned them. He held that number and breathed through what it meant. Everin's hand came to rest on his shoulder. He did not speak. "Where is Vitch?" Lior said. At 0430 the answer came through. Vitch had attempted to reach a third vessel pre-positioned 60 kilometers north of the handoff point. The fourth element of the intercept team, which Tavith had coordinated quietly without mentioning it during the original briefing, had been at those coordinates since midnight. Vitch was in custody. Alive, going to remain alive long enough to be processed by every legal authority with jurisdiction over a man who had moved 347 Omegas across international waters. Lior sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. 4 years, Zoran said. 4 years, Lior confirmed. By morning the documentation transfer was complete. Legal authority notifications confirmed across 4 jurisdictions. The lawyer in Singapore detained before noon. 2 border officials apprehended by end of day, the third by the following morning. Breckett's preliminary forensic assessment confirmed that the command structure Lior had built was accurate in every independently verifiable detail. The 41 number came from Caius, mid-morning, pushed across the table on a tablet. "That is how many Omegas the financial evidence you provided will allow us to identify retroactively," Caius said. 41 we did not have documentation for before you handed over your files. He looked at Lior across the table, that cataloging gaze with nothing else in it. 4 years produced that. It should be said out loud. Lior looked at the number. "I know," he said. "I know you know," Caius said. "You did not have anyone to say it to before." He pushed the tablet aside. He stood up and went back to his screen. The matter of emotional acknowledgement concluded with the same efficiency as everything else. Lior watched him go, and held the 41 in his head, alongside the 12, alongside the 347, and let the full weight of all of it be exactly what it was. The dock was operational and quiet in the late afternoon. They brought the vessel in with professional ease. Lior stood on deck as the harbor came fully visible and breathed air that smelled like salt and the specific humid warmth of a Philippine coastal city in late afternoon. His feet were on a solid surface. The Red Tide network had a ceiling on it now, built from 4 years of his work and 11 days of the Dreven Pack's work and an intercept team that had been waiting in the dark. The work was not finished. Months of legal proceedings still to come, depositions to file, a documentation trail to trace through every jurisdiction it crossed. But the structure of it was standing, and the people who needed to fall had started falling. Zoran stopped beside him on the deck, looking at the dock rather than at Lior. "The operational phase is concluded," Zoran said. He paused. "There is a separate matter requiring discussion." Lior looked at the side of his face. "The non-operational reasons," he said. Zoran turned to him. His expression had the controlled quality of a man about to deliver something he had been managing carefully. "We agreed on the raft that what happened there would not extend past the end of the heat." He said it without accusation. "I accepted that condition. I am telling you now that the acceptance was inaccurate. We cannot honor it." He did not look away. 4 Dreven Alphas do not work a heat and then disengage. Biological orientation has already formed, and it does not resolve when the heat concludes. We are oriented toward you, all 4 of us. That is real, and it is not going away because we said it would. Lior looked at him for a moment. "What are you telling me? That we are going to want to see you again?" Zoran said it flat and direct. "That we are going to want more than the heat required. That the 3 of them and I discussed this on the deck an hour ago and reached agreement." He paused. "I am also telling you that none of this overrides your decision. If you want to honor the condition you set, we will honor it. We will finish the operational debrief. You will go wherever you are going next. and we will not follow unless you want us to." The total evenness of his delivery was the thing that made Lior's chest tighten. No performance in it, no pressure. A man reporting something true and leaving the response where it belonged. Lior said, "Why did you agree to the condition on the raft if you knew you could not keep it?" "Because you needed to hear it to consent." Zoran met his eyes. "And because I was still telling myself at that point that I could manage it." Lior looked at the porthole where the other three were visible on the foredeck. 3 versions of the same face in the afternoon light. He had spent 4 years moving between port cities and cargo operations and cover names and not once staying anywhere long enough for it to matter. He looked at 3 men who shared a face with the man beside him, and all 4 of them were specific to him now in ways that had nothing to do with the heat. He thought about 4 hands answering yes in unison when he asked if they could keep going through the heat waves. He thought about Evren's hand on his shoulder when the 12 came through confirmed safe. He thought about Caius's mouth saying the 41 should be said out loud. He thought about Taveth's not-quite smile becoming completely complete for one precise moment. He thought about Zoran's knot locked inside him and Zoran's face above him not looking away. "I need to tell you something," Lior said. Zoran said, "Tell me." "In 4 years I filed 11 reports with IMOPA." Lior said it directly. "Every report recommended escalation. Every report was downgraded." He held Zoran's eyes. "You were the 12th IMOPA contact I had in 4 years, and the first time anything was acted on in time to matter." He paused. "That is not why I am staying." Zoran said, "Why are you staying?" "Because on the raft, when your knot was locked inside me and your hands were on my hips hard enough to leave bruises, I felt something I had not felt in 4 years. Lior said it without flinching. "Specifically located and completely real. I want to know what it is when the heat is not running." Zoran's expression shifted in the small, specific way it shifted when he had made a decision. He reached out and put his hand on the back of Lior's neck, not on the gland, just above it, and held it there. The warmth of the contact traveled through Lior's spine and settled into his lower back. "So do I," Zoran said. Lior nodded. Then he stepped past him and went to the foredeck where the other 3 were standing and looked at all of them directly. "I am going to need a place to stay during the legal proceedings," he said. "Depositions and documentation review. Several months minimum." He looked at Taveth. "Is that accurate?" Taveth said, "Minimum 6 months. Likely longer." Lior looked at all 4 of them. "That is the practical reason." He paused. "The actual reason is that I do not want to go back to a hotel room. I have not wanted to be anywhere specific in 4 years. He looked at Zoran last. "I want to be where you are. I do not know fully what that means yet. But it is true." Evren stepped forward and pulled him in. Both arms, comprehensive, Lior's feet briefly off the deck, his face pressed to the top of Lior's head, and he held on. Caius came to stand close and put his hand on the back of Lior's neck, above the gland, the thumb pressing into the muscle there. The contact on that specific location sent a current through Lior that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with the specific meaning of that touch between an Alpha and an Omega who were moving towards something real. His gland responded to it, warm and awake, open to Caius's scent, without the heat's demand pushing it. "Just want." Taveth said, "I want to document this." He said it factually because documentation was how Taveth held things accurately, and that was its own form of intimacy. Zoran waited until the 3 of them had finished, and came to Lior and looked at him with nothing managed over the surface of it. "We have a house in Cebu," he said. "Large enough. Close to the legal proceedings." He paused briefly. "You can have your own room." Lior looked at him. The offer of his own room was considered, and Lior appreciated it in the same moment that he planned to communicate it was not a priority. "Later tonight," he said, using the word Zoran had used on the raft. "I am going to come to your room. We are going to continue the conversation we started on the raft." He looked at all 4 of them, all 4 rooms, in whatever order makes sense. Caius made a low sound in his chest. Taveth said that he would suggest beginning with whoever was on watch rotation and working logistically from there. Evren's arms tightened briefly around Lior before releasing. Zoran's expression had the quality of a decision made and found satisfactory. "We dock in 2 hours, he said, reassembling his operational manner. Underneath it, the thing that had been there since the raft was fully visible now, and Lior looked at it and let it be visible. The restaurant Zoran knew 2 streets from the berth was small and practically lit, and the food was exactly as good as advertised. They ate at a round table in the back with the appetite of people who had not eaten properly in longer than they had tracked. Taveth updated them on intercept proceedings between courses in the same tone he used for everything. Evren noticed when Lior's ribs made leaning forward uncomfortable and wordlessly angled his chair. Caius asked 3 smart questions about the documentation structure and received 20 minutes of detailed answers because the questions warranted them. Zoran said little through the first half of the meal, and then, over the last course, told Lior the house in Cebu had a proper high-security workspace, and that working from hotel rooms was not a workspace. Lior considered disputing this, and recognized it was accurate. "Point taken," he said. Zoran poured more tea into his cup, without looking at the cup. On the walk back to the berth, the city had settled into evening and the harbor was going dark in sections and the streets near the water were quiet. Lior walked in the center of the 4 and the positioning had not been discussed, and all 5 of them were aware it had not been discussed. Tavith came up beside him at the last block before the dock. "The non-operational reasons," Lior said. Tavith looked at him sideways. "Yes. I want to hear you say them," Lior said. "Your version." Tavith was quiet for half a block. Then, "I have been running assessments on optimal outcomes since we pulled you out of the water. Not operational outcomes." He paused. "The probability of a version of this situation in which we walk away from the dock tomorrow and function normally within a standard adjustment period is very low. The probability of a version in which we do not walk away and see what happens next is considerably higher for all 5 of us." He glanced at Lior. "Those are the non-operational reasons. That is the most analytical expression of wanting someone to stay I have encountered," Lior said. "I considered other approaches," Tavith said. "This one was the most accurate." He looked back at the dock lights. "I wanted you to hear the accurate version." "I am staying," Lior said. "I know," Tavith said. He paused. "I wanted you to say it." The support vessel was quiet at the berth. The support staff settled in for the night. Wreckage had left a final documentation package and a transmission from the AMOPA director that was complimentary in the specific, measured way of people who were already planning the next use of a resource. Zoran read it and set it aside. Lior went to the narrow cabin designated for his use and sat on the bunk and held his bandaged wrists in his lap and looked at the porthole and the dark water beyond it. His ribs were reminding him of their condition with increasing specificity now that the adrenaline and the heat chemistry were both fully cleared. He was exhausted in stacked categories. He was also entirely certain that he was not sleeping alone in this cabin. The knock at the door, when it came, was unhurried. All 4 of them filled the small cabin past reasonable capacity. Lior looked at them in the doorway and felt something settle in his chest that he identified after a moment as the specific sensation of things coming into alignment after a long time of being misaligned. Evren spoke first. "Your ribs need proper attention." His voice had the particular quality of a man making a proposal in the form of a statement. He came in and sat on the bunk edge and addressed the ribs with careful hands, pressing and assessing and wrapping properly. The contact was clinical in the sense that he was genuinely addressing the ribs. It was also Evren's hands on his body in a quiet cabin, and both of those things were true simultaneously without canceling each other. Zoran took the cabin's single chair. Caius leaned against the wall beside the porthole. Tavith sat on the floor with his back against the bunk, which was not a comfortable position for a man his size, which he did not mention. Evren finished the ribs and moved to Lior's wrists, cleaning and properly dressing both of them with hands that were very careful on the raw skin. When he was done, he did not move away. "I want to tell you something," Lior said to all 4 of them. "Tell me," Zoran said. Singular. The others deferred to this. "On the raft I set a condition I could not keep." Lior said it plainly. "I knew when I said it that it was probably not accurate. I said it because it was the only way I could consent to what I needed without feeling like I was making a decision I had not calculated." He looked at Zoran. 4 years of moving alone taught me to be precise about conditions because conditions were what kept me safe." He paused. "This is different. I know it is different, and I am done pretending I do not know." Zoran reached forward and put his hand on the back of Lior's neck, above the gland, and held it there. The warmth of it traveled through Lior's spine the same way it had on the deck and settled the same way. "Tonight you sleep," Zoran said. "Your body needs it, and the ribs need it, and the heat chemistry needs it." His thumb pressed once into the muscle. "Tomorrow, when we reach Cebu and there is space and proper conditions, we continue the conversation." He looked at Lior steadily. "All of it, however long it takes." Lior nodded. They arranged themselves around the small cabin with the practical ease of 4 people who had been a pack for 31 years. Evren positioned himself with his back against the bunk, his shoulder available, and Lior's head ended up there. Caius took the floor on the other side of the bunk. Tavith stayed where he was, back against the bunk base. Zoran remained in the chair with his forearms on his thighs and his eyes on the porthole and whatever he was calculating quietly in that flat, direct mind. Lior lay back and felt the four of them around him, and felt the particular weight of a room full of people who were staying. He had not had a room with people who were staying in 4 years. The presence of all four of them in the small cabin was enormous. He breathed it, and let it be enormous, and let the exhaustion take him down, and slept before he finished deciding to. In the morning the harbor was gray, and the overnight rain had come through and left the air clean, and the dock wet, and the sky pale at the edges. Lior woke to Evren's hand on his shoulder, and the quality of a room that had been occupied through the night by people who were still in it. All four. Zoran was in the chair, awake, watching the porthole with the quiet attention he gave things in the early hours. Caius was awake with his eyes on Lior. Tavith was at his device with the focused motion of someone who had been running updates since before the light changed. Lior sat up, ribs better, wrists stiff but manageable. He looked at the four of them. 4 versions of a face he had learned in one day to distinguish without effort. 4 separate people who had pulled him out of the water of the Sulu Sea and who were present this morning, still present as the night before, with no reduction in the quality of it. "Ready?" Zoran said. Not a question. Lior looked at him. "Yes," he said. He meant more than ready to travel, and all 4 of them understood the full weight of it, and none of them needed it. Said again. The support vessel left the harbor at 0700. They stood on deck as the coastal city receded behind them, and the Sulu Sea opened up in the early light, gray and wide and quieter than it had been 12 hours ago when the intercept was running. Lior stood in the center of the 4 without discussing the positioning, and let the morning air come at him and breathed it fully. He had things still to do. Legal proceedings that would run for months, depositions to file, a documentation trail to trace through every jurisdiction it crossed. 41 Omegas to be identified by the financial evidence he had handed over, adding to the 12 who were safe, working toward the 347 that the Red Tide network had moved and that the case would now account for. All of that was still in front of him. He was going to do it from a house in Cebu, a house with a proper workspace that Zoran had described in the flat, direct way he described things he had already decided were going to happen. A house with 4 alphas who had found him handcuffed to a sinking hull in the Sulu Sea, and had not for a single moment considered leaving him there, who were standing around him right now on the deck of a vessel moving toward the next thing. Caius stood close enough that their shoulders were in contact. He did not move to create distance, and Lior did not either. Evren's hand came to rest briefly on Lior's lower back and withdrew, warm and present and not requiring acknowledgement. Tavith said, from slightly behind him and without looking up from his device, "The house in Cebu has a very good view of the water." He said it in the tone he used for facts he considered worth reporting. Lior looked at the water around them, and then at Zoran, who was looking at the water with the particular quality of a man who was done calculating the risk of something and had moved forward into it. "Good," Lior said. The Sulu Sea was wide and the morning was opening up across it. The work ahead of them was real, and it was going to take as long as it took, and he was going to be where the 4 Dreven brothers were while it happened. He had told himself for 4 years that nowhere specific was a liability in the work he did. He had been correct. The work he had been doing required it. The work he was doing now required the opposite, required a fixed point, required stable access and sustained presence and all the things that being nowhere specific prevented. He had a fixed point now. It was 4 men on the deck of an IMOPA support vessel moving north through the Sulu Sea. It had 4 specific faces and 4 distinct qualities of attention and the particular warmth of 4 alpha scents he had learned to distinguish in one night and would not forget. He was going to stay. He had said so, and he had meant it, and the meaning of it was settling into him the way things settled when they were true, not the relief of decision but the weight of something real beginning. 4 years of moving and 1 day of being pulled out of the water and everything that came after, and now the morning after all of that with the specific solid feeling of being somewhere worth staying. Zoran turned from the water and looked at him. In the morning light, the pale gray-green eyes had the quality they had carried since the raft, direct and decided, and now with something forward-facing in them that had not been there when they were still calculating. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Lior looked back at him for a moment. Then he turned forward and watched the sea open up ahead of them, wide and lit by early morning, and felt the 4 of them around him and felt the work still ahead and felt, underneath all of it and more specific than any of it, that this was the right direction. The vessel moved north. The Sulu Sea moved under it. Lior Vane, who had spent 4 years handcuffed to a case with no one to hand it to, stood on the deck with his hands finally free and let the morning come.